The command pattern is a great way to compose functionality in your applications. In a previous video, I talked about how I typically go about naming and creating commands, and like an idiot, I didn't follow my own advice. In this app, I'm going to show you how I went about implementing the command pattern. So I'm going to start with where my commands are located and what they're named. So we'll start with the app module, and everything in this application that is a command is called a task. So to avoid confusion, when I went through my naming conventions for commands, replace that with the word task. And there's one other thing that differs a little bit that I'll get into here in a second. But in the app module, you'll see that I define one task. Again, this is a command, and the name is query task. When we go into each module, any of the commands are kept in a task folder. And so you can see here the Data Dragon module is where most of the functionality of the application is. And I have tasks in two different folders. In the core, or in the root of the task folder, are all of what I call public commands or tasks. And these can be called from outside of the module. Anything inside the internal folder, by convention, should not be called outside of the Data Dragon module. And there's nothing that enforces this, it's just sort of by convention. So you can see here there's quite a few different tasks, and they're named similarly to what I indicated in another video. There's a verb and a subject with the suffix of task as opposed to command. The other thing I wanted to point out, if we look at the core module in the task folder, there's really no concrete tasks here. There's, as I indicated, there are some protocols and some utilities and some base classes. So let's start with the NIO task. This is a protocol that says anything that implements this protocol must implement a run async method. And again, differing from what I indicated in another video, this is the equivalent of the execute method. So every task must implement a run async method, again, the equivalent of the execute. For now, let's ignore what every task returns. This has nothing to do with the command pattern. This has to do with the bolts framework and is the subject of another video series, but we're not going to talk about it at all in this. The next thing I want to look at here, just to call out attention, there are some base classes. So I have a base SQL task and a base SQL query task. So anything that does inserts, updates, and deletes will descend from this base SQL task, and it just provides some basic functionality so that I don't have to duplicate code in all of my subclasses. There's yet another base class that's specific to running queries, which descends from the base SQL task, and it adds the ability to make things easier to run queries. So these classes down here have to do with Typhoon, and I'll talk about that in another video. But if you want to have a look in the application, take a look around at some of the functionality in the commands, you'll be able to see that they're, as I mentioned, they're singly focused. There's relatively small amount of code in each task, and they're easy to get your head around. I want to take a quick look at two specific tasks or commands just to give you an idea of what they look like. So let's start with a networking task, get realm task. Let's look at the header file. All it declares is an initializer where it passes in one of its dependencies, and then the run async method. So all this really does is it uses AF networking to hit a remote endpoint to go get JSON data. That's all this task does. So it's very simple. There's, including blank lines and curly braces and all that, there's only 48 lines of code in the whole thing. So that's not so bad. Easy to read and get your head around. Now, when I get the data, let's look at the corresponding insert for the realm. Let's see, insert data dragon realm task. So again, there's a simple initializer where it declares something that it needs to carry out its job. And then the code is very simple. There's the run async method. It's 2 lines of code. It runs an insert against the content resolver. It tells what table it wants to insert into, and it passes along the values that it needs to insert, which it builds up here. So all of this data will come from data that it retrieved from the remote endpoint. So very simple. Each task is minimal to get your head around. It's very simple code. There's not a whole lot of code to read. So it's just a superior pattern for breaking your application functionality down into distinct pieces.